Hello and welcome to the Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past week of coverage on Monocle Radio, with highlights from our studios here in Midori House and from around the world. This week...
The radical idea of human rights is that it's about everyone everywhere. We don't make exceptions and we don't make distinctions when it comes to the respect for human rights.
We'll hear from the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. Plus, could Sicily finally get its bridge to the mainland?
My parents who grew up in Sicily have told me countless stories of when they were growing up in the 60s, their parents saying, oh great, by the time you graduate high school, you can take the train to Rome. And obviously it's been, not to age them, but roughly 50 years since then.
All that and much more in the next hour, here on The Curator, with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. We begin this week in my home country of Brazil, where Jair Bolsonaro was placed under house arrest after breaking pre-trial rules as he faces charges for attempting to stage a coup. For this week's edition of the Foreign Desk Explainer, Andrew Muller asks why Trump is throwing his support behind Brazil's former president.
They're treating President Bolsonaro very unfairly. He's a good man.
It's a weird penalty, house arrest, in that the degree of punishment sustained depends significantly on the property in which the interned is interned. If you are a scofflaw sentenced to house arrest when you live in a tiny flat with mould, mice, screaming children, a whining spouse and a neighbour teaching themselves the bagpipes on YouTube, you might well put your hand up and ask the judge if the local prison is really all that crowded. If you are, however, an erstwhile head of state currently hanging your suits in a 2-storey pile with a garden and swimming pool in a pleasant gated community in an upscale suburb, it's not going to be the toughest shift to pull. For this and other reasons, the claims on our pity of former President Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil are flimsy, gusting downright rickety. Bolsonaro has this week been grounded in his Brasilia villa on the orders of Brazil's Supreme Court, who have also taken his phone off him. It is unclear as of this recording whether or not he has also been told he can't watch South Park or have any ice cream.
That can't be true!
Prezado Presidente Donald Trump, recebi com muita alegria.
Bolsonaro has incurred this sanction by using the social media channels of 3 of his sons, a councillor, a member of parliament and a senator, to whinge about the trouble he was already in. The Supreme Court's chief beak, Justice Alexandre de Moraes, accused Bolsonaro of, quote, encouragement and instigation to attacks against the Supreme Court and blatant support for foreign intervention in the Brazilian judiciary. We will come back to the foreign intervention angle shortly, as it is kind of the point of this explainer, as it turns out that there is at least one person on earth who sympathises with Bolsonaro, you'll never guess who, etc. But first, a brisk recap of Bolsonaro's travails, which is necessary to bring us up to speed, and quite good fun, as he has very clearly brought it all upon himself, and given that a subplot of this explainer is someone, again, you'll never guess who, etc., evading a richly merited comeuppance, we should enjoy the spectacle of just desserts being served when and while we can. Bolsonaro was elected president of Brazil in 2018 and served from 2019 to 2023. He was, and indeed is, your central casting conservative nationalist populist blowhard, ostentatiously keen on God, country and military, less so on women, gay people, indigenous people, trade unionists, journalists and people who don't vote for him. He ran for re-election in 2022 and lost, extremely narrowly, to the left-wing-ish Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Though Bolsonaro did not reject the result as such, nor did he concede gracefully, and he flounced off to Florida for a bit. As Lula was being sworn in on January 8, 2023, an angry mob of Bolsonaro's supporters attacked several government buildings in an attempt to, at least, disrupt the installation of the new government. Bolsonaro claimed it was nothing to do with him and indeed damned the events as vandalism, but prosecutors were unconvinced. Bolsonaro is one of 34 people on the hook on charges associated with attempting to stage a coup d'etat and is looking, if convicted, at prison time sufficient to amount to a life sentence for a 70-year-old, very possibly in accommodations significantly less agreeable than those to which he is presently confined. Bolsonaro denies everything. At which the reasonable listener may be thinking, well, where is this foreign intervention angle we were promised? This all sounds very much like the Brazilian justice system handling Brazilian business, as the Brazilian justice system should. Here is a heavy hint. Think, if you can, of another president, also broadly matching the conservative nationalist populist blowhard description, whose heart may for some reason go out to someone facing the rest of his natural in the clink for inciting a seething rabble to try to overturn an election result.
They were peaceful people. These were great people. And I mentioned the word love. The love in the air. I've never seen anything like it.
Accordingly, US President Donald Trump has done all of the following. He has placed sanctions on the Supreme Court judge leading the investigation into Bolsonaro. This is Justice Alexandre de Moraes, the same judge who last year suspended Twitter/X in Brazil for refusing to comply with local regulations around the spread of disinformation. Twitter/X subsequently buckled. Trump has also imposed a 50% tariff on Brazilian imports, despite the fact that the US actually, contrary to Trump's claims, has a trade surplus with Brazil. In fairness, though in fairness seems the wrong phrase, these penalties are somewhat theatrical, with exemptions carved out for stuff like oil, timber and aircraft. Indeed, only about 36% of Brazilian trade with the US will be affected, almost as if a Donald Trump edict has been issued to create sensation rather than effect.
I love the people of Brazil.
So why did
Two
you
Marines
deserve? They don't
close
seem
the
to
right
be
time.
related to trade
Because
the
the
president.
people running Brazil did the wrong thing.
As for why, well, whatever criticisms of President Trump may reasonably be made, he cannot be accused of shielding his motivations. Greater guile and more discretion is exhibited by any given dog in the vicinity of biscuits. If Trump has taken a keen, even morbid interest in Bolsonaro's woes, one does not require an advanced understanding of anything whatsoever to fathom the reasons. Putting a former president in prison for attempting to subvert the constitutional order by force? What if it catches on? For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
You are with The Curator, our weekly highlight show here on Monocle Radio. The prospect of a bridge being built between Sicily and the Italian mainland has been discussed in families for generations. Everyone lives in full expectation that it will happen one day. But it never arrives. There has been informal talk of the bridge as far back as Roman times. So could the prospect of final approval and a secured budget finally mean something is done? For Wednesday's edition of The Briefing, Emma Nelson was joined in the studio by Anita Riota, Monocle's producer and our resident Sicilian. Emma began by asking Anita to explain just how large this bridge looms in political mythology.
I think that is exactly the right place to start with this conversation because it cannot be overstated how large this project looms in the Sicilian psyche and political mythology. As you mentioned, it was first the Romans that thought about how to tackle connecting the island to the mainland. My parents who grew up in Sicily have told me countless stories of when they were growing up in the 60s, their parents saying, "Oh, great, by the time you graduate high school, you can take the train to Rome." And obviously it's been, not to age them, but roughly 50 years since then, and there is no bridge. More specifically, the first real proposal of the bridge to connect Sicily to the mainland comes when Italy is still a monarchy in the 1800s. Since then, It had another real approval in the 80s. The president and the prime minister of Italy at the time said that they would be done by the mid-1990s. Of course, that doesn't happen. And I think what's interesting to note is that as of 2001, when Italy had elections, both political candidates, both the left-wing candidate and the right-wing candidate, came out in favor of the bridge. So for ages, for decades and decades, this was not a politically divisive topic. Everyone sort of wanted to be the prime minister that got it over the line. And for many factors endemic to Italian politics, no one was ever able to.
So at the moment, we're still trying to get a ferry, aren't we, from Palermo to Naples? So that prime minister who will get it over the line, will that prime minister be Giorgia Meloni?
Well, look, I think that's definitely one of the large motivating factors here. If we're discussing how much this looms in the political mythology of the country, then obviously being the person to actually get it done will be monumental. It sort of gets you into the Italian Prime Minister Hall of Fame at the very least.
And the prospect of this latest plan coming, I can't remember the number of times I've looked at a plan being approved to do this. And there is that slight fear, though, that if the Romans couldn't do it, there is very little hope for any other of us a few thousand years down the line. Is this ever going to happen?
I think if it's going to happen, this is as good a moment as any. The reason that the Meloni government is looking to push this bridge plan now is because it's looking to recast the project as being key to national security. This comes as Italy is trying desperately-ish to hit the new NATO target of spending 5% of GDP on defense and national security. So they're now trying to bill this bridge as being a national security project so they can put that spending into the NATO bucket and hit that 5% target a bit easier.
In what way does the bridge become a security advantage for Italy?
Well, so the argument that the Meloni government is making is that the Mediterranean is becoming more of a geopolitical hotbed. She says that Russia is trying to project itself onto the Mediterranean, and so having this be a strength of Italy's, that it can maneuver around the Mediterranean more easily, will actually be a geopolitical asset. Now, some critics of her trying to get this done in this way by sort of recasting it as geopolitical say that there does need to be an influx in Italy of defense spending and military spending. But the critics are saying that there are other projects. There are ports and bridges and roads and airports that also need to be, revamped in Italy. But if we're talking about what happens if war really reaches Western Europe, those more priorities should be on the Alps, on the Adriatic Sea, that, you're not really going to look to deploy troops over this 3-kilometer suspension bridge.
That was Anita Riota, Monocle's producer of the Foreign Desk, speaking to Emma Nelson earlier this week. Australia has chosen a Japanese company to build the next generation of naval frigates, favoring Mitsubishi Heavy Industries over bids from Germany, Spain, and South Korea. This is Japan's first deal to export warships. With more on this, Emma Nelson was joined from Canberra by Jennifer Parker, former naval officer and expert associate at the National Security College, Australian National University. Emma began by asking why this decision is attracting so much attention.
We haven't actually, so Australia hasn't actually signed any contracts yet, but what they have done is selected one ship from 4. So originally in February 2024, the Australian government announced that they were going to expand the Australian Navy's surface combatant fleet, so the frigates and destroyers that the Navy uses. In December 24, it was down selected to 2, so a German bid from TKMS and a Mitsubishi bid from Japan. Why was Japan selected? Look, the Australian government says that Japan was selected because the capability, which is the upgraded Mogami-class frigate, was the best capability. Now, it is a very modern designed vessel. It has significant endurance, 10,000 nautical miles, they're saying. despite its size, which is about 5,000 to 6,000 tonnes, it is actually quite small to crew. So a lot of its capabilities are automated. And Mitsubishi is saying the crew is about 90 people. And most modern frigates now have a crew of between 150 and 200. So that's quite significant. I think also the commonality of some of its missile systems and combat systems with US missile combat systems, which also make up the backbone of the Australian fleet, have been key elements. And so certainly it looks to be a decision based on the capability. But I think also the burgeoning or the growing strategic relationship between Japan and Australia, which has rapidly evolved in the last 10 years, was probably also a factor.
Tell us a little bit more about the reason why, when you touched on it just a second ago, about why Australia needs to renew its frigates.
Well, I mean, the first thing to think about when we think about Australia is Australia has no land borders, right? So it is an island nation. It has the third largest exclusive economic zone in the world. It's the fifth largest user of shipping. And all of its trade is through the maritime domain, right? We import 91% of our fuel. So we have a huge dependency on the maritime domain. The Royal Australian Navy currently has 10 surface combatants. So our surface combatants are made up of some destroyers that are quite new, but also 7 older Anzac-class frigates that were built between 1996 and 2006. They are getting pretty old. The average life of a frigate is 20 to 30 years. And unfortunately, over the last nearly 15 years, the government has not been making decisions. So governments of both flavours haven't made decisions about replacing them. So we've gotten to the point now where it's urgent to replace them. The second element, though, is that the decision to expand the surface combatant fleet. So normally Australia operates between 11 and 12 frigates and destroyers. That's kind of been the way since the 1960s-ish. This government decision last year, which is kind of reconfirmed by the selection of the Japanese frigate, is about expanding the size of the Australian Navy to operate 20 surface combatants. And why is that the case? Well, it is because of Australia's dependency on the maritime domain, but it's also because regional security is deteriorating, and Australia is very concerned about that.
And when you mean regional security is deteriorating, by which do you mean China?
Look, I actually mean a couple of things. Of course, I do mean China, and I think you can't underestimate or understate China's aggression in the region. So, largest navy in the world, they're using that navy to harass Taiwan. We're seeing increasingly large joint exercises in the vicinity of Taiwan every few months. We're seeing harassment of the Philippines in the South China Sea within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. We even saw earlier this year a circumnavigation of Australia for the first time ever by a Chinese naval task group. Again, I mean, they can do that latter one lawfully, but we're seeing this expansion, we're seeing this aggression, and so that is destabilising the region. But I think there are other trends too, and I think one is that more broader than China, we are seeing states resort to the use of force to settle their differences. We've seen that in some of China's behaviour, but we've also seen that in the Middle East. We've seen that in Europe, in Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and we've actually seen that in the Indo-Pacific between Pakistan and India, and most recently Thailand and Cambodia. So I think those two trends, coupled with the breakdown of the multilateral system, has really made Australia reassess its strategic situation. It is concerned about those things, and it is specifically concerned about China's aggression in our region.
That was Jennifer Parker, former naval officer and expert associate at the National Security College, in conversation with Emma Nelson for Tuesday's episode of The Briefing. The state of human rights around the world is challenging, to say the least, with conflicts from Russia's war in Ukraine to Gaza to Sudan, and governments ignoring human rights principles and the rule of law. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Türk, is among those who continue to press for respect of human rights. He met with Monocle's Chris Chermak at last week's Helsinki Plus 50 conference, celebrating a 50-year-old agreement that enshrined human rights principles into Europe's security for the first time. Chris began by asking how difficult the job is.
Well, it is. If one looks around the world and looks at the state of human rights in the world today, you can imagine this is one of our... It's not easy at all. But I have to say, I also see a lot of glimmers of hope. I see that the type of work that we are doing, but also that people embrace human rights around the world, is something that you cannot take away from them. With all the headwinds that we face, there is still, I would say, the motivation that young people have for human rights causes, that student movements have. I'm thinking of Bangladesh, Serbia, who use human rights because it's the strive for freedom that they initially wanted. So yes, it's a very difficult time, but I'm also very encouraged by some developments around the world.
It's interesting, just from how you mentioned that is perhaps one of the challenges at the moment, that there is more of a recognition of the role of human rights among the people than there is of governments.
Yes. If you look at Bangladesh last year, it was around July that there were massive student protests because they felt that the authorities were not working for them. They were very frustrated, and there was a groundswell of support, not just by the students, but also within the society. And yes, what the then government did, they asked the police and gave orders to repress, to have people disappear, to even shoot at the students. And it shows, yes, this incredible gap that we have between responsible governance on the one hand, that is not responsible, that stifles dissent, that represses freedoms, and on the other hand this yearning for freedoms and the yearning for getting rid of oppression and repression. And I think Helsinki is important because it reminds us that this was also possible at a time when the Cold War tensions were very high.
Is that another one of the problems today? We are here at this Helsinki conference 50 years later. That was a time where governments from around the world were coming together, including the Soviet Union. This time, there isn't that same dialogue, I suppose, at that point. Is there less recognition today of the need for multilateral institutions, governments to come together and find a way to discuss things like human rights?
I think it's very important, first of all, to know the history and to be aware and learn the lessons from the history for the present and for the future. That's absolutely clear. I also think that peace can only be achieved when you open up communication channels and when you are able to find a way to address whatever needs to be addressed in a peace negotiation, because of course war pits one group against the other, right? That's what war does. The realities are often much more complex. There's never black and white. I think we have lost the ability of deconstructing complexities and engaging in a way that actually leads to a solution.
Just finally, on deconstructing complexities, there are two conflicts in particular that you mentioned in your speech here in Helsinki, and that was Ukraine and Gaza. Two very different conflicts with two very different support groups, which leads, of course, some to suggest there are double standards in the international community. How do you go about dealing with that kind of challenge for your job?
It's, in the current context, extremely important to remember that human rights is not an ideology. Human rights is coming out of experiences, historical experiences, and it provides the consensus that we need in the world to move forward. And the radical idea of human rights is that it's about everyone everywhere. We don't make exceptions and we don't make distinctions when it comes to the respect for human rights. We don't say that one country gets away with it, another country doesn't. So double standards for us is not an option. And it's not an option for whoever wants human rights to be respected in this world.
And has it been harder for you to report on things on the ground, you mentioned as well in your speech, in both of these conflicts?
Yes. I mean, in Ukraine, we are no longer present in the occupied eastern part, which makes it more difficult, but we are still continuing reporting on it. In Gaza, in the West Bank and in Gaza, we are present, but we are present in a much smaller way. And unfortunately, for instance, the Israeli government did not allow my international staff to go back to Gaza and the West Bank, and that is a problem. We have national staff there, but not international staff. And I wish it's in the interest of everyone that there are objective, independent eyes and ears out there that report about what's happening. It's the same with journalists. I mean, if journalists are not allowed to go in, it's very difficult.
That was the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Türk, speaking to Monocle's Chris Chermak there. Staying with Chris now and his recent trip to the Helsinki Plus 50 conference. Media freedoms have been in decline in recent years, with governments emboldened to clamp down on independent outlets through direct measures, such as foreign agent laws and imprisonment, as well as more indirect methods, such as costly lawsuits. Monitoring the situation in Europe is Jan Bratu, former Norwegian ambassador and since the start of this year, the OSCE's representative on freedom of the media. He began by describing his own characterization of a media landscape that is under pressure.
Indeed, I knew that media was under pressure in very many countries when I agreed to put my name forward for the position. But quite frankly, I wasn't aware the extent of the pressure in almost every part of the OSCE region. We can say the pressures vary. In some parts of the region, it is predominantly economic pressure, financial pressure. In other parts, it's physical pressure. Journalists are being targeted physically, sometimes even killed. So I think we see a degradation of the working environment for journalists across the whole OSCE region. And I have to admit that I didn't really understand how widespread and how serious this is. Take, for example, let's say Western European countries, the prevalence of slap lawsuits. These are strategic lawsuits against public participation. They're malicious. They are unfounded lawsuits that are simply taken out by business people, by politicians, to prevent media from actually reporting, to drain their resources, not just financial resources, but also time resources. And some media outlets are being subjected to dozens of these types of lawsuits. And it's happening in countries where we wouldn't think that these things would happen. In almost every country of the OSCE, there are slap lawsuits, and I think we can expect more of them in the time to come. That's just one kind of pressure.
Have you been able to identify, I suppose, a general cause when you say that you're surprised by the extent of this? There seems to be a greater license these days to enact these kinds of things, go after slap lawsuits, foreign agent laws, whatever else is out there. There seems to be a greater license, a belief that they can get away with it.
You're right. It's a huge change. It wasn't like this 20, 30 years ago. We're seeing that the principles aren't being held in regard by more and more politicians. And yes, they think they can get away with it, and in many cases they do get away with it. And that encourages others to do the same. I don't think there's one explanation that covers all the cases of pressures against journalists. But for example, you have the statement that media is the enemy. Journalists are the enemy. We never heard talk like that 30, 40 years ago, not to mention 50 years ago. It didn't mean that politicians back then were satisfied with media coverage. Certainly not. But they respected the right of the media to ask probing questions and to dig into stories. They didn't like it. Now there seems to be this conviction among many politicians, East and West, that we don't like the coverage, so we're going to go after the journalist. We want compliant media. We want compliant journalists. We want our story out there. We don't want any difficult questions being asked. Actually, they want propaganda. Now, I think inherently politicians like to have control. East or West, I think all politicians would like to have control. But in the Western countries, certainly, and up until recently, I think in many other countries as well, politicians understood that in a democratic society, free media is a pillar. And without free media, there will not be a democratic society. I'm afraid that I'm coming to the conclusion that the support for democracy, for democratic government, is on the decline. I mean, democracy takes a lot of work. So I think we need to think very seriously about what's actually happening in our societies. Freedom of media, safety of journalists are the proverbial canaries in the coal mine of democracy. If we see pressures against media, we should understand that there's pressure against democracy and we're in trouble.
I did want to ask you about one more direct threat, I suppose, to journalists, and that is foreign agent laws, because this is something that is happening in a number of countries. It's almost a copy from one government to another, as I've heard it described by some people. What is your view of these? How do you go about trying to tackle them? Because they are spreading to different... They're a more naked version of a slide into authoritarianism, arguably. But how do you go about confronting them, particularly here in Europe?
You're absolutely right. Foreign agent laws are the death knell of independent journalism in many countries. And why is it happening? Well, it's happening because fundamentally the financial sustainability of media all over the OSCE region is under huge attack. Media outlets are struggling to survive financially because the internet and social media-based platforms have basically taken all the advertising revenues. This makes independent media outlets in many countries dependent on grants from foreign donors. Now, ideally, they should be getting grants from their own governments. Norwegian media, Swedish media, Finnish media get grants through government processes. That doesn't happen in a lot of countries. We see that some governments don't want to have independent media. They understand that the way to stop this is to pass foreign agent laws. You're right, it's happening in more and more countries. I am reacting. I'm raising the issues on these foreign agents laws, especially when we hear foreign agents laws being passed in countries that are either members of the EU or aspire to EU membership. And then they complain about media funding that comes from the European Union. And I find that a bit strange, and I guess it raises questions in my mind, at least, as to how serious those countries really are about joining the EU.
Just finally then, if I may, is there something that gives you confidence that media outlets can survive even under some of these challenging circumstances?
Well, you're asking a really tough question now, and I would like to say that I'm optimistic. I guess I have to say that I'm trying to be realistically optimistic. I think there is a market for quality journalism. I think there is a market in every country for quality journalism. I also see in some countries that there is a market for local journalism. I think in Europe there is a tendency that people are ready to pay for local newspapers. They want to know what's happening in their local vicinity. That's the good news. But again, I'm coming back to the question, so how to fund it, how to ensure that we have a media landscape that is conducive to quality journalism. I think that's a big question, and that's one of the topics that my office, the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media Office, is working on. And I think it's going to be hugely difficult to reach consensus on that issue. But we have to try. We have to keep standing up for the principles. We have to try to keep finding answers to really difficult questions.
James Bloodworth there, the OSCE's representative on freedom of the media, in conversation with Monocle's Chris Chamak. Still to come here on The Curator, we'll take a deep dive into Japan's capsule toys and the exhibition that features the development of the industry over the last 60 years. And we meet the author, James Bloodworth, to hear about his new book, Lost Boys. Stay tuned.
We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Banking is our craft.
You are with The Curator, our weekly highlight show here on Monocle Radio, and I am Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Our next highlight comes from Thursday's edition of the Monocle Daily. Each week, we receive a letter from a Monocle correspondent or producer around the globe. This week, it was the turn of Laura Kramer, who sent this letter from Bucharest.
Bucharest has always been the city where I was born, but rarely the city I stayed in for too long. My earliest memories begin here. It was a tough childhood under the brutal Ceausescu regime. I remember long queues for food staples like bread, cold winters with no heating, and the careful hush in adult conversations when politics came up. People speaking in coded language, even in their own homes. The revolution in 1989 was sudden and chaotic. I remember the sound of gunshots in the streets as my mother and I lay in the hallway waiting for my father to return alive and in one piece. Today, there are visible bullet holes from that time lodged into the side of some buildings, but people are speaking freely without looking over their shoulders. But since I moved abroad, most of my visits have been stopovers, brief stints en route to my grandmother's village at the foot of the Carpathians, a 2.5-hour drive from the capital. But a recent reporting trip for Monocle changed that.
E victoria voastră, să știți!
Suddenly, it wasn't a stopover as I was passing through. I was searching for a different set of stories in my hometown, and what I found was a city on the brink of something big. Yes, Bucharest still wrestles with some of the same problems my parents used to complain about while growing up: aging infrastructure, a tight public budget, and a special kind of bureaucratic fog familiar across the region. Still, beneath all that is an energy that's hard to ignore. There's a new confidence emerging, especially in business, design, and hospitality. Romanian creatives are rehabilitating the city's grand, if battered, architecture, launching fashion showrooms, concept studios, and independent publishing houses with a distinctly grungy flair. This summer brought news of the Trump brand's planned debut in Romania, with the Trump Tower Bucharest in the pipeline, slated to house luxury apartments in the capital. Timeline TBC. Earlier this year, the Corinthia Grand Hotel du Boulevard Bucharest opened its doors, an all-suite boutique luxury hotel, which next month will host Romania's first Michelin star chef series. The lineup features internationally renowned chefs, bringing a new level of culinary prestige to the capital. So, with tourism on the rise and investment coming in, for the first time in a long time, Bucharest seems ready to claim its place on the map as a destination in its own right, not just a quick detour. I should know, I treated it like one for years. For Monocle in Bucharest, I'm Laura Kramer.
You are with The Curator, our weekly highlight show here on Monocle Radio. Much has been said about the upcoming generations of young men, many of whom, in search of life guidance, are turning to the likes of Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, and other nonsensical individuals that inhabit the manosphere. James Bloodworth's new book, Lost Boys, A Personal Journey Through the Manosphere, is a collection of dispatches from this realm. The book holds additional weight by the fact that Bloodworth, by his own admission, once took a few steps towards membership of the manosphere before thinking better of it. Monocle's Andrew Muller spoke to James earlier this week and began by asking what had briefly attracted him.
Yeah, so in 2005, I was looking on the internet. Had been through a long period. I was quite young and shy and socially awkward. And I was in college at the time. There was a young woman I was interested in, but I was just kind of clueless. Like, how do I ask?
This is a tale as old as time.
Yes, it is. And then I went home one day after college and Googled how to ask a girl out. And I discovered this forum, and it was kind of men sharing. I kind of didn't really know what to think, first of all, but kind of worth a try, worth reading, see what they're saying. And it was it turned out to be a pickup artist forum, which would become famous that year through a book by Neil Strauss.
This is The Game by Neil Strauss.
Yeah, kind of undercover, looking at this subculture of men who gathered on online forums to kind of share, some of it relatively benign, like tips on how to kind of grooming tips, or, you know, what aftershave to wear, or how to approach someone you like in a bar. But then there was also kind of this whole systematic idea of gender relations. So they thought they believed they had gender relations to like this exact science.
I mean, some of it is, as you say, harmless. The idea of teaching people how to start a conversation or open themselves up a bit or overcome shyness. But it's kind of the gateway drug, I guess. And this is what I think makes your book more interesting than most studies of this sphere, in that you get to a certain point in the manosphere and then sort of realise, actually, a lot of these people are just awful and I don't really want anything to do with it. Whereas, of course, a lot of people do keep going, and that's where they end up becoming acolytes of the likes of Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, and similar weirdos. When you think back on the period, was there a particular moment for you where you thought personally, I'm not enjoying this and I'm not happy about it and I'm not comfortable with it?
I mean, the reason I became interested in that stuff initially was because basically I wanted to have a girlfriend. It was just like, oh, how do I...
A reasonable ambition.
Yeah, like kind of, there was a lot of men in the community who kind of were in the manosphere at that time. It was just like, how do I get a girlfriend? Often men who had worked in engineering jobs, kind of socially awkward, and they tended to see social interaction through a problem-solving context. But then the longer you spent in the culture, the more you'd kind of become marinated in this view of men and women, which was very, very objectifying about women, obviously, but also very essentialist. So men and women were kind of depicted as caricatures. And I think for me, when I kind of thought like, I don't really need this, it was too elaborate and too kind of dehumanizing. So I didn't really want to. It was cool to just learn a few kind of openers for when you go out or something, just conversations, basic conversation starters. I didn't see any harm with that. But there was also, it was all kind of marinated in this idea that it was just this positivistic science that you can just break down interactions with human beings, and then you start to lose the humanity in the other person, that they're just as variable. If you say certain things, they'll respond a certain way. And just kind of the language, the kind of the day-to-day language people would use about women, basically, in the subculture was kind of off-putting. As someone who was mainly brought up by women, it kind of jarred the way they would casually talk about women.
I mean, that's possibly what saved you, because the thing that strikes me from not only reading your book about the people who get properly hardcore about this, but just my own encounters with the subculture online, the thing that always strikes me, and I'd be interested in your views on this, that for all that they are impelled by a desire for women, they don't actually seem to like women very much.
No, and often so there would be a mixture of people who kind of fell into the manosphere, so to speak, or fell into the pickup community then, and some of those people just were kind of regular guys in some ways. But then you did meet other people who kind of it wasn't really about the women in the end. It was about women as kind of a trophy to show off to their friends, and women as a kind of reward object for a correct performance of masculinity or whatever. Women were kind of status objects, like a sports car or money or something. That was something I definitely noticed. And the longer people spent in the community as well, the more they were around this kind of objectifying these attitudes, rating women on a scale of 1 to 10 and seeing women as just kind of these objects to be manipulated. I mean, someone could be a misogynist or at least overlook the misogyny when they found the community, but the community would very often make men worse misogynists.
I think another thing that baffles the outsider, and it certainly baffles me, is that when you look at the kingpins of this movement you investigated, and it is people like Jordan Peterson, people like Andrew Tate, they just come across as just such obviously preposterous figures. What did you glean about what their appeal is? What makes people look at somebody like either of them and think, yes, that's what I want to be like?
I mean, it's partly social media. So the one thing that's changed in recent years is when I was younger, there were no algorithms. So I could kind of leave the community behind, and my YouTube algorithm or whatever wouldn't be pushing more radical videos onto me. And the other thing that social media has allowed is, or changed at least, in the past, people like Andrew Tate, kind of confidence men, may have, put out an ad in the back page of a kind of top shelf magazine or something, or men's magazine or something like that, promising these kind of get-rich-quick schemes or these life coaching or whatever. But social media apps like Instagram, video-based, picture-based social media apps, they allow these charismatic influencers to present a lifestyle as well as the personality as well. So kind of telegenic charisma of someone like Andrew Tate or even Jordan Peterson. But they can also show off a lifestyle like fast cars, big houses, private jets, exotic travel, nice food, and also being around lots of glamorous women all the time, and these kind of status objects. And for teenage boys, that can be very alluring, that kind of thing. You tend to grow out of seeing those things as necessarily the be-all and end-all of life. But when I was younger, that wasn't really there either. So now they can these kind of personalities can communicate directly with a young person and also broadcast a lifestyle. And of course, what they don't tell people is that the lifestyle is often funded by the subscriptions of people who pay for these courses.
The author James Bloodworth there in conversation with Monocle's Andrew Muller on Monday's edition of the Monocle Daily. And finally on today's show, little capsule toys are a common sight at fairgrounds the world over. But in Japan, the small toys that come out of special vending machines remain a major industry for children and adults alike. Celebrating 60 years of their arrival in Japan, the so-called Gacha Gacha exhibition in Tokyo features 11 manufacturers and 5 creators who have contributed to the development of Japan's capsule toy industry over the past 6 decades. Monocle's Ryuma Takahashi visited the exhibition and spoke with Onoo Katsuhiko, founder of Japan's Gacha Gacha Association, about the history and future of the Gacha Gacha business.
From tiny character toys to detailed portable toilet miniatures, even ID photos of complete strangers, Japan's capsule toy industry is said to produce over 300 new unique products every month. Known as Gacha Gacha in Japanese, capsule toy culture came to Japan from America 60 years ago. To mark this 60th anniversary, the Gacha Gacha exhibition is running in Marunouchi Building in Tokyo. I spoke with Katsuhiko Onoo, founder of the Japan Gacha Gacha Association and the organizer of this event.
The Gacha Gacha exhibition stems from my desire to pass down this Gacha Gacha culture, which has now become part of Japanese culture, to future generations. These products themselves originally came from America, but there's always been an underlying Japanese culture of collecting and cherishing small things. Now it's interesting that even adult women are purchasing capsule toys. And this exhibition's concept is about wanting to understand and connect with these people. The market size in 2024 was about 824 million euros, and 2022 was about 359 million euros. So it's almost doubled. When I joined the Gacha Gacha industry 30 years ago, it was about 59 million euros. It's an infrastructure business. There are about 800,000 Gacha Gacha machines in Japan. Naturally, some locations will stop selling and get eliminated. But because it's an infrastructure business, it will never disappear completely.
According to Onoo, Japan's capsule toy industry is currently experiencing its 4th wave of popularity. In the 1980s, major toy manufacturer Bandai entered the market, rising prices from around 10 yen to 100 yen products. The 1990s saw machine innovation that enabled 200 yen products, improving quality and dramatically increasing adult target items. The 2000s brought even higher priced products that became popular on social media. Until now, the industry has evolved by targeting adults alongside higher pricing. The current 4th wave is driven by the rise of Gacha Gacha specialty stores, he says.
During COVID, many stores closed in shopping malls. When malls needed to fill vacant spaces, Gacha Gacha specialty stores moved in because they require minimal labor and setup costs. In 2025, there are about 1,300 such stores in Japan. Previously, Gacha Gacha was just individual vending machines. Now specialty stores consolidate around 1,000 machines in one location and use social media marketing, making them much more efficient.
Gacha Gacha is no longer unique to Japan, expanding overseas, particularly across Asia. Onoo believes that overseas cashless payment culture might drive the next innovation.
Taiwan, China, and Korea are also experiencing gacha booms, with many specialty stores opening. However, these countries have cashless cultures, so the traditional coin-operated culture hasn't really taken root. Bandai, the leading toy manufacturer, is developing smart gacha, cashless machines. Currently, we can only offer products up to 500 yen due to machine constraints. But this industry has always innovated with price increases, and I believe cashless technology could be the turning point.
What really drives this industry is the passion of creators and planners who keep improving quality as prices go up. Ono, who has been leading the industry for over 30 years, talked about what makes gacha so appealing.
For me, the appeal of gacha goes back to its origins, watching children use their own pocket money to turn the handle and experience both joy and disappointment. That truly makes me happy, especially when it's my own product. I believe all creators feel the same way, which is why we all strive for quality and never compromise on our products.
For Monocle in Tokyo, I'm Ryuma Takahashi.
Thank you, Ryuma. The Gacha exhibition is being held at Tokyo's Marunouchi building until the 15th of August. Well, that's all we've got time for this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by San Impi and presented by me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Join us again next week to hear some of the very best of the programs here on Monocle Radio. Thank you for listening.